In a significant escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, Iran has overnight launched about 200 missiles towards Israel in revenge attacks, sending Israeli citizens into shelters across that country. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is vowing retaliation for the attack, which appears now to have finished without causing serious damage.
The missile launches came just minutes after a suspected shooting and stabbing attack in Tel Aviv, which killed at least 6 people and injured several others. Israel's military has also been carrying out attacks in Lebanon, targeting Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah. Our Middle East correspondent, Allyson Horn, is in Tel Aviv.
I was between the northern Israeli city of Haifa and Tel Aviv when suddenly my phone started pinging almost, it felt like endlessly, with these rocket alarm alert sirens that we get when there are incoming rockets to the country. It just kept pinging every second, and I looked down to see that there were dozens of alerts throughout the centre of the country, including in the area that I was in. And then I looked up and I saw an unending stream of giant balls of light flying across the sky. This was Iran's ballistic missile attack on Israel. 180 missiles fired by Iran, according to the Israeli military. And as we watched it, it just seemed like it wouldn't stop. In front of me as well, I had the Iron Dome, which is Israel's missile defence system. It was shooting up rockets into the sky to intercept those missiles coming from Iran. And I was watching above me as there were explosions after explosions in the sky before my cameraman and I headed into shelter, as did millions of Israelis across the country, for which this attack came quite unexpected and has left the country of Israel quite shaken. This is only the second time in Israel's history that Iran has launched an attack directly on Israel. The first was in April earlier this year, and now tonight we have had the second attack of these 180 missiles, ballistic missiles, very powerful missiles. The Iranian guards in Iran say that this attack was in response to the Israeli assassinations of a number of senior militant leaders, including the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, that was killed on Iranian soil a couple of weeks ago, and also the leader of Hezbollah, the militant group in Lebanon. His name was Hassan Nasrallah. He was killed by Israel just a few days ago. But Iran says this attack is now over. It says the wave of missiles that it sent into Israeli territory is its retaliation for these Israeli killings, but it has warned Israel that if Israel tries to respond, Iran is leaving open the door for further attacks on Israel. So the question now really turns to what kind of a response there will be. Israel has already said that there will be consequences. It will launch some sort of military action. It's just now waiting to see what that will be and whether or not it will push what has until this point been a relatively contained conflict into a bit of a wider war.
Allyson Horn, who's done remarkable work for us this morning there from Israel. Let's take you now to Washington. Our North America correspondent Carrington Clarke has been monitoring reaction there. How has the Biden administration reacted, Carrington?
Well, we know that the US President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris watched these events unfold from the secure Situation Room at the White House. We know that the US President had put his military on order to help in the defence. He had ordered them to help in the defence of Israel and to defend the sizable US assets that are currently in the Middle East. There's tens of thousands of American military members in the Middle East, and there are sizable other military assets as well. Now, we know that the US President had been working with the Israelis. We didn't have the same type of notice as the strike back in April when Iran had that barrage of missiles directed at Israel. There wasn't the 72 hours that was given then, but the US president says that they had been planning for some sort of Iranian attack, and they had been working hand in glove with the Israelis to be prepared for that. Now, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, says that this is further evidence of just how destabilising and dangerous a force Iran is in the region, and that Israel retains her unwavering support, and that they will do everything they can to help Israel defend itself. Now, Jake Sullivan is the National Security Advisor to the US President, and he outlined exactly how involved the Americans were in this defense.
U.S. naval destroyers joined Israeli air defense units in firing interceptors to shoot down inbound missiles. President Biden and Vice President Harris monitored the attack and the response from the White House Situation Room, joined in person and remotely by their national security team. We are still working with the IDF and the authorities in Israel to assess the impact of the attack.
Now, the president was asked whether or not there would be a response to this attack. He says that the Americans are still assessing exactly what has occurred, the nature of this attack, the type of missiles that were used, and what they were directed at. Now, the question, of course, is whether or not Iran was meaning to have significant impact. The president describes this as a defeated attack. He says that it was ineffective. The question, of course, is whether or not Iran they had the real ambition of hitting targets and wanting to escalate this further. They are in a position where they seem to have felt the need to respond to the killings of both the head of Hezbollah and Hamas in recent months, and they are declaring that this is now at an end. The context is, of course, important here. Last week, we had the United States briefing media that they were close to a deal for a 21-day immediate ceasefire on the Lebanese Israel border. That was then knocked down by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who then proceeded to give the order to strike into Lebanon to kill the head of Hezbollah, which has precipitated this particular event. Now, America is saying that they are working with Israelis at the moment. We know that the president was planning to speak with the Israeli Prime Minister even before this latest attack by Iran. But the question is whether or not they are going to back a further retaliation from Israel. It's always difficult trying to decide cause and effect, obviously, in these scenarios. This is a long simmering conflict between Israel and Iran. At some point, somebody needs to take their foot off the accelerator and stop the retaliatory cycle. But obviously the concern right now is how far this potentially escalates and how wide this conflict becomes.
Carrington Clarke, appreciate the update there from Washington. Somebody with a deep understanding of Iran, Israel, in fact the entire Middle East, is former Middle East correspondent Ben Knight for the ABC. Ben, in fact, you were in Israel again as late as earlier this year. These missile attacks have clearly rocked the Israeli people, but also the government.
Yeah, and I've been wondering how the Israeli people will have been responding to this, and in relation to the government as well. I was trying to look through some opinion polls. They're not easy to find, and I guess like opinion polls everywhere, you can tell which ones are aligned with, which all depends on the questions being asked. But look, what we do know is that Benjamin Netanyahu was a Prime Minister who, not that long ago, was absolutely on the ropes. He is facing charges of bribery, fraud, breach of trust. Those charges are still there. There have been calls for him to step down and face those charges, and criticism for him from people, protesters who we spoke to inside Israel, who say he is deliberately prolonging. They accuse him of deliberately prolonging, at the time, what was the conflict in Gaza, in order to stay in a war cabinet and in order to hold on to office. He has rejected that. But what you are seeing is a Prime Minister who, even just a few weeks ago, was still facing weekly protests every Saturday night in Tel Aviv, you would see tens of thousands of people out on the streets calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to stand down. Some of them were concerned about, the criminal charges, but others were saying the reason he needs to stand down is because he has failed. He has failed as the man who billed himself as Mr. Security. He has failed to bring the hostages home. He has failed to make us safe. He has failed to bring an end to the war. And let's not forget, Israel is a country that has conscription. If you're a young man, you will go into the military for 3 years. If you're a young woman, you will go into the military for 2 years. And there is a very, very good chance that you will see combat. So one of the other criticisms was that, I remember we were there on the day when 20 young Israeli conscripts were killed by a rocket-propelled grenade in Gaza. They were there. They were in part of that Gaza operation. And the backlash against Benjamin Netanyahu was just horrific. Now, let's fast forward to where we are now. You have Benjamin Netanyahu, who is still in power, is now Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister. His support is rising, and as we've talked about, he's now put together a string of tactical successes against some of Israel's greatest enemies. Not just tactical successes, but people remember it's not that long ago, the walkie-talkie explosions, the pager explosions.
Only a fortnight ago.
Only a fortnight ago. That wasn't just a tactical win. That was a humiliation for one of Israel's nearest and I'd say probably most feared enemies. So he's riding that at the moment. So where now, the question is, where do the Israeli people stand on potentially opening up that new front or striking back against Iran in a way that doesn't, I guess, do what has happened previously, where you sort of draw a line under it. Iran strikes, Israel strikes, and we say, OK, that's it, we're done until next time. We're in a position now where people are concerned that that is not going to happen. What do the Israeli people think about that? I really don't know. As we talked about, this would potentially be a fourth front opening up for Israel. Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon and potentially Iran. That's a lot, and particularly in a country that puts its young people into the army and would be the ones fighting the war, but also when you're in a situation where the war comes to Israel.
Ben, it's been wonderful to have your analysis this morning. Thank you so much for joining us on The Desk.